You might start to settle into the body. You might notice the feeling of the body on the cushion or the bench, wherever you're sitting. You might take a deep breath or two. Notice feelings of the body touching the air. What it feels like for the lungs to expand. You might notice too any movement of air on your skin. Your face, on your arms. You might notice the small movements of the body from side to side. And with those movements, you might try and settle into a comfortable and stable position. And from this steady and stable position, you might continue to notice all the sensations of the body. The pressure, tingling, little bits of energy, emotion. Just let those feelings come and go as they please. Just notice them. So you don't need to do anything but notice. If you like, you can continue on meditating in that way, just being aware of the sensations of the body. Or you can follow along with me and let those sensations continue to be in awareness, but in the background. The sensations of the body anchor you in the present moment, but you might shift your attention to thoughts. And thoughts usually reside somewhere near the head, often towards the back of the head. If you're not familiar with looking at thoughts, you might just think one intentionally right now and see where that sound or image appears. And so, with the attention watching for thoughts, you might just be aware of them as they come and go. Thoughts are no different than any other sensation. They come and go as well. Many thoughts are driven by a little bit of hurt, some worry, some shame, some agitation, or wish for a different sensation or state of mind. And often this hurt is rooted in childhood. We didn't feel something we needed to feel. So you can think of these thoughts as maybe manifestations of your inner child. Most thoughts that arise just have a little bit of hurt to them. Maybe a skin knee. When a child has skinned their knee, all they really need is just a little bit of kindness and attention. And that's all. You might approach thoughts in that same way. Just give them a little kindness and attention. You don't need to buy into whatever story you're trying to tell. say they're there. Let them go on their way. I like practicing this way for a while. Just sit here and wait for this line of children with skin knees to come up to you, wanting attention. Just giving them a little kindness and letting them go on their way without buying into the story. Most thoughts just have a little hurt to them, a little dissatisfaction with the world. Some thoughts have more. In the case when thought that has a great deal of hurt to it comes along, it's okay to set aside this practice and do self-compassion in whatever way feels good to you. You might have noticed that sometimes a child comes up to you with a skinned knee. You send them on their way, and they fall down and they skin their knee again, come right back up to you. It's okay. The process is exactly the same. Just give that thought some kindness and send it on its way. However many times that happens. You might have noticed that sometimes several seem to come at once. It's okay too. Just give kindness to all of them. Send them on their way. practice is always the same, no matter what thought comes up, no matter what story is being told. Just give it some kindness and let it go on its way. In these last few minutes, you can continue on if you like. And just relax all effort and just be present. Nothing to do. Thank you all for sitting with me. Last week I spoke about metta, but I'd like to continue on with that discussion. But I want to recap first a little bit about last week. Last week I spoke about metta as being this feeling of warmth or openness, or a kind of general positive inclination of the mind towards yourself or another being, or no being in particular. And metta is something that it's not transactional. It's not something you do in order for somebody else to do something for you. It doesn't have any strings attached. Metta is something that all of us are capable of. It's not always going to be present in every moment, but it's something that we're all capable of, just by virtue of being human. I talked about kind of traditional metta practices. I talked about metta in your daily life. I offered the idea that one way to practice metta in daily life is to kind of get in tune with your heart, the natural ebb and flow of the heart being open and closed. And you might, when the heart is open, you might just kind of lean into it a little bit. I find that a surprisingly effective way of practicing metta. We talked a bit about why you might want to practice metta too. Basically, your life will be better and the lives of those around you will be better too. So that's kind of where we left off, and I wanted to continue from there with the idea that we've talked about building metta and talked about it's a good idea to build metta. Kind of the next question that comes to me from that would be what you do with that metta. I think that's a much trickier question, actually, because the idea of do you want to generate metta? The answer to that is yes. It's always good to have metta, and if you have metta, it's always good to have more. But what you do with that is not always so straightforward. Your instincts might often be wrong, and you can do things with good intention that end poorly, that don't actually help people. So that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. I think the answer to that lies in there's a metaphor for practice that you may have heard. Practice is often compared to a bird with two wings, compassion and wisdom. And I'll read this quote from Matthew Ricard. He describes it as, understand that just as a bird needs two wings to fly, you must develop wisdom and compassion simultaneously. Wisdom is a correct understanding of reality, and compassion is a desire for all beings to be liberated from the causes of suffering. There's these two ideas, and the way forward is to use them both. Not use one or the other, but both. In my mind, when I read that quote, I think of an albatross, which I don't know if you've seen an albatross fly, but they're these very majestic birds. Their wingspan is like 10 feet or something. And when they fly, they rarely flap their wings. They're mostly just kind of gliding. And that feels like a good metaphor for what life is like when you follow the Dhamma. You're just kind of gliding through life very peacefully, maybe making adjustments here and there, but not a lot of agitation or suffering. You might compare that to a bird with, kind of mismatched wings, a very long compassion wing, perhaps, and a very small wisdom wing. You might get a sense for how kind of chaotic life might be if that's how you're approaching things. So the answer is to have both, to have compassion and wisdom, to use your heart and your head. Another metaphor that works for me is finding the right course of action might be like shooting a basket. You want to first orient yourself in the right direction, right? If the basket is over here and I'm facing this way, it's going to be really hard for me to make that shot. So you want to face in the right direction. And that is the compassion piece, or the metta piece. You want to let your heart orient you towards the well-being of all beings. But you also want to use your head too. It's not enough to just face the basket and throw the ball with some random amount of force. You're probably not going to make it. You need to see how far away the basket is and kind of make an educated guess about how hard you need to throw it. And you need to take a look at the results of your shot and see if you need to throw it harder next time or softer. And in just the same way, if you act from a place of the heart, you need to look at your action too. You need to see, did this actually help people? And if not, how should I change it? So, working with the heart, I think the thing that's tricky for some people, definitely for me, is that it's not always available to you. That signal from your heart. I spent many years not being able to hear that, and so if that's the case, one thing you might do is take maybe inspiration from people you know that do have access to their heart. So the Buddha is a great example of this. We have many examples in the suttas of the Buddha acting from a place of great kindness. So if you're in a particular situation and you don't have an intuition as to what kindness would be in that situation, you might be able to find some case in which the Buddha has acted in a similar situation. You can do the same thing with friends or Dhamma teachers that you feel have access to the heart. So that's a helpful thing to remember, I think. You can also remember times when you have felt open. You mentioned a little earlier that there's a kind of natural ebb and flow to the heart. And we do have periods when we're very open, even if it's not always available to us. And so we can bring the memories of what that felt like and what we might have acted like in that instance back to the present moment and just act from that place. One of the big revelations that has come out of practice for me is that what you feel does not necessarily need to lead to what you do. So you may be in a situation where you can't really feel kindness or can't really feel it very strongly, but you can still figure out how to act in a useful way and just act in that way regardless of what you're feeling. Which maybe that seems very simple or straightforward to you, but I did not understand that for a long time. I think one other thing to remember about the heart is that when you hear that voice, it's not always the pure voice of the heart. Sometimes it's filtered through the sense of the self. So maybe a thing to watch out for would be when your heart is telling you to only care about certain people or care about certain people more. And that's a false voice and maybe not one to be followed. But kind of heart that we have inside all of us is the heart that cares about all beings equally. So we need the heart to orient us in the right direction, but we need the head too, because the heart is not really very sophisticated. Our minds can make these wonderful models of the world that are very complicated and very useful in predicting things. And the heart doesn't really have access to that. So one example, there's a story that's a good example of this. Some charitable folks in, I think around the turn of the century, they were looking to help people in sub-Saharan Africa. And they went over there and they spent some time with the people and saw what was difficult about their lives. And they found that one pretty difficult thing was that there wasn't a lot of groundwater, so most of the water that they used came from wells. And sometimes those wells would dry up. And when the well would dry up, that means you're walking to the next village. And that next village might be a couple of miles away. And you can imagine what a chore that would be to have a several mile round trip when you're carrying all the water that your family needs to cook and drink and bathe and stuff. So there was quite a lot of effort, and they felt that if they could fix this situation, it would be very helpful. So they came up with a pumping mechanism. They couldn't make it electrical because there wasn't much. There wasn't always a reliable electrical system there. And they had this clever idea. They thought that if they made this kind of a fun toy that the kids wanted to play with, they could get the kids to do the work, because pumping water is a lot of work. And so they attached this kind of merry-go-round thing to the pump. And so, their hope was to kind of like kill two birds with one stone, like give the kids a fun thing to play with and help the women have an easier time getting water. So they made a bunch of these, and I'm sure felt very pleased with themselves. And they came back some years later, and they found that they mostly weren't being used. And it turns out that the merry-go-round thing was too heavy for the kids, and they couldn't really push it, so they didn't want to use it. And the women didn't want to use it either, because they felt kind of humiliated to be like pushing around this child's toy to get water. So they mostly just did what they were doing before. And to me, this is I don't know what was going on in their heads, but to me, this is a case of like wanting to do well, having the heart component there, but perhaps not using their head enough. So bringing in the wisdom component is it's maybe a little different than working with the heart. I think the problem for many people with the heart is not being able to access it, but we all have access to our intellect. Like we live in a world that requires the use of that. So we're all able to move through the world that way. The problem is often pulling back from that, turning off that way of thinking. So the thing to do with that is to just understand that the models you have of the world that your mind makes, that your wisdom comes up with, they're not always right. They're just your model of the world. They're just your view. And I read a bit from the Metta Sutta last time. I'll read just a short bit here that I didn't read last week that speaks to this point. So this is towards the end of the sutta, after it's kind of described what someone far along on the path would feel when they're feeling metta. And says, this is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. So by not having fixed views, by not buying into the story, or not just blindly believing it, you're not born again into this world, meaning you don't suffer. So I think that's a good way to figure out how to act. Having both compassion on one hand and wisdom on the other. It doesn't necessarily tell you what to do. It's just more telling you how to orient yourself to find the answer to that question. I think I'll share one more aspect of this too. And that it seems to me that as you practice, the heart piece may stay the same, but it seems that the wisdom that's available to you changes. It seems that you start off practice, and the wisdom you have access to is the kind of mundane wisdom, the wisdom of the story. So let me digress and explain story. There's the experience of the moment, and the story is everything we put on top of that. So an example might be, you're feeling sensations in the moment, and the story might be these sensations are anger. And you can go further in the story and you say, I am feeling angry. You can continue on and say, I am feeling angry because this person said this thing to me, and this person said this thing to me because they feel this way, right? You can put layer after layer after layer on the story. So that's story. And getting back to my point, I think the wisdom that you can bring to the table changes with practice. You start off with this mundane story wisdom, and you transition over time to the wisdom of the Dhamma, the wisdom outside the story. The understanding of how the world really is, anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. And to relate that to the basketball analogy, if metta is orienting yourself towards the basket, and wisdom is knowing how hard to throw the ball, moving out of story and into more of the Dhamma wisdom is like moving the basket closer to you. So if you engage in the world using less story, there's less layers between how you relate to the world and reality. So it's more likely that you can see actions that will benefit yourself and others. But if you have all these layers of interference between that, things get fuzzy and you can't really see it as easily. And I see that as a movement from complexity to simplicity in terms of how you act, and I guess your life in general. And I have a story that I hope will illustrate this concept. In my old apartment, I had a bird feeder, and I would put out birdseed every morning, and some birds would come, and they were mostly little sparrows. I got to know them pretty well. In particular, there was one sparrow who I don't know if he had a birth defect or some kind of injury or something, but one of his legs was kind of splayed out, and he couldn't really put weight on it, and the wing on the same side was kind of cockeyed. But anyway, so I got to know these birds pretty well, and I got a lot of value out of being around them, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what their life must be. I don't know what it's like to be a bird, but it seems like a probably pretty precarious existence. You're always looking for food or water, and I'm sure you're on the lookout for predators, and disease kind of runs rampant in little birds. And especially this one in particular, having some kind of physical disability as an animal is not, it's not going to be very easy. So I had a lot of feelings for them. And, one thing I could have done with those feelings is, use the kind of mundane wisdom and see all these things as problems to be solved, I'm not sure exactly what I could have done, but, maybe I could have tried to, catch the bird and take him to a vet and see if he could be helped in that way or something. But that's not what I did. It didn't seem to me like anything that I could do would be particularly beneficial. And so what I did is I just sat with those feelings, and I just gave out my birdseed every day. And I feel like the more I practice, the more I think that kind of attitude, just this very simple way of being kind without being in the story, is appropriate in more situations. Not all the time, at least. And sometimes you do need to go out into the story and interface with the world that way. But it seems to me that practice leads towards a life of simplicity in that way. That was kind of what I was trying to get at earlier with the meditation. I don't know how well it landed, but we have all these voices, both the internal voices of our thoughts and the external voices of people, telling us things. All these voices trying to pull us one way or the other, and it often seems like something needs to be done. And even when you have metta or compassion in your heart, you're often pulled into the story. But I think I know it's not always necessary, and I think it's pretty rare that it's a good idea to actually do anything. I think a lot of life can just be met in the same way that I was hoping to show in the meditation. Just meet it with kindness and let it go, and you don't need to buy into the story. This is my thought, at least. I don't know that I know anyone who's enlightened, but if I had to guess, there's one person I do know. That if he's not enlightened, he's probably pretty close, and he lives this way. He's not famous. He does teach the Dhamma, but he lives this very simple life, and he's just kind to the people around him. He doesn't need to kind of go outside and find ways to act outside of himself. The power of this way of being is, I think, reflected in his Sangha, which is just the most warm and welcoming group of people I think I've met. I think that's the way to be. I will end with a quote from the Maha Parinibbana Sutta, which is Digha Nikaya 16. And this is when the Buddha is near death, and Ananda, his faithful attendant of many decades, comes to visit him and is a little worried because now there's not going to be a teacher for the Sangha, and he wants some teachings to kind of carry them on. This is what the Buddha says. Now I am frail, Ananda, old, aged, and far gone in years. This is my 80th birthday, and my time is spent. Therefore, Ananda, be lamps unto yourselves. Be a refuge unto yourselves, with no other refuge. Let the Dhamma be your lamp. Let the Dhamma be your refuge, with no other refuge. Be lamps unto yourself. That's good advice, I think. just we all have the Dhamma in us. We all have access to that. We don't need to go outside. The teaching is inside you. That path is available to all of us. We all have that instinct towards awakening. That part of us that knows the way home. I think life can be very simple if we let it. Just let the heart orient you in the right direction. Let your wisdom, the Dhamma, be your guide. That's what I have for you all tonight.